Hello, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell, and I'm coming to you from an apartment in Brooklyn, New York. I hope this travels across the ocean, or as the pond, as they call it, and finds you in your conference. And I hope you can see me clearly and hear me clearly. I'm still astonished that we can do these things, and just depending if I did it right. I hope I did. It's a treat to be with you, and I appreciate the invitation. I am going to tell you about one of my favorite topics in the entire world, namely the condition that is so misleadingly called ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And I'm going to give you pointers on how to create the best environments to bring out the best in children and young adults who have this condition. A little bit about my background, so you can decide if I have any right to talk about this at all. I am a child and adult psychiatrist. I've trained in the Harvard residency and fellowship programs and served on the Harvard faculty for a number of years before I retired to devote more time to my family and to the writing of books. I wrote a book with John Rady in 1994 called Driven to Distraction that surprised me and many others by suddenly taking off and kind of brought this condition to a world that had never heard of ADD or ADHD. It was called ADD back then in 1994. And when I was writing it, I realized that I had the condition myself. Of course, I've always had it, but I didn't know until 1981 when I heard a description of it, how much it fit me. And then in the ensuing years, I saw a lot of people who had it, and was able to put together some thoughts about it, which I will share with you today as I continue to talk with you. It's so strange not seeing the audience. You know, I'm always trying to imagine you, and I hope I can connect with you, even though I can't see you. But I learned really from my patients, from my learning about it in 1981, realizing I had it myself, because the textbooks didn't describe it the way I knew it to be. I knew there was more to this than a list of negative symptoms, which was what the textbooks listed. I knew there was more to it than that. And so during the 80s, leading up to writing the book in 1994, I really had the patient be my textbook. And it was patients who taught me the truth about this condition. Since 1994, I've written 20 more books, and the most recent is another one about ADHD called ADHD 2.0. It came out in January of this year of 2021, and I finally learned my audience. It's my shortest book ever. It's only about 100 pages long, and that's about as many pages as people with this condition want to read, and there is an audio version of it as well, so it's not entirely up to you to read the book, or you can have someone read it for you. But that's my latest, and I wrote it again with John, our latest thinking about what this condition is. And it's so much more interesting than what most people think it to be. This is so much more beguiling and complicated and wonderful, but also bedeviling, and it is a condition that can both make your life and break your life. And it usually does a little bit of both. And my job is to maximize the advantages that go with it and minimize the disadvantages. I don't think there's any condition in all of psychiatry and all of mental health where you can go one of two ways. You can go to the very top. There are Nobel Prize winners who have ADHD. There are self-made millionaires and billionaires. There are Pulitzer Prize winners. You name me a profession and I'll name you someone who's at the very top of it, who has ADHD. But at the same time, it can also be a curse. The prisons are full of people with undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. the halls of the addicted and the unemployed and the marginalized, the multiply divorced, the accident prone, the people who just can't, quote unquote, get it together. And that's, why I'm so passionate about this, particularly getting to people while they're still young to get them on the right track. Because if they get off on the wrong track, there's hell to pay. I mean, it can be a lifetime of struggle, if not misery, and even early death. Russ Barkley has shown that untreated, this condition takes an average of some 13 years off a person's life. It ranks up there with cigarette smoking in terms of morbidity and even mortality. So it's a high stakes game we're playing in diagnosing and treating this condition. But the good news is, with the right help, you can get that great outcome and you can avoid that terrible outcome. There's always a little bit of luck involved, but it's so important that you get the right guidance, the right help, the right information, because there's a ton of wrong information out there. The internet is just strewn with wrong information. People who absolutely have no idea what they're talking about, grinding an axe for some point of view that for whatever their hidden agenda might happen to be. Well, just so you know, my agenda is to tell you the truth as I know it, as I've come to learn it, from my patients, from myself, from my children, and from the many experts that I've come to know and learn from over the years. I have no allegiance to any single point of view, but I am allied with what I call the strength-based approach, which simply says I recognize there's an upside to this condition and not a downside, not just a downside. And the problem with the deficit disorder model is it stresses only the downside. The DSM-5 names only the downside, and even the name itself, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Not only is it pathologizing, but it's wrong. It's inaccurate. We do not. I have it myself. I also have dyslexia, I should add, which I also wouldn't trade for the world. Both of those conditions, you can manage them right, they're assets. So attention deficit, we don't have a deficit of attention. If we did, it would be a form of dementia, which it certainly is not. We have an abundance of attention. We who have ADHD, we are overflowing with attention. We have more attention than we know what to do with. Our challenge is to control it. That's our challenge. It's not a deficit at all. And I don't see it as a disorder per se. I see it as a trait that has positives and negatives. And as I said, my job is to maximize the positives. My job is to help people of all ages, tap into the strengths and avoid the damage done by the vulnerabilities, the problems, the weaknesses. And, I'm now 71 years old. I've been at this quite a while. And I think I have a pretty darn good idea on how to do that. By the way, if you hear cats, the person who owns this apartment has some cats and they're meowing right now. It's not my stomach growling. Okay, so how did we get to where we are today? Let me just give you a little bit about the history of the condition and let you know how we got to where we are. People sometimes think this is a new discovery, ADHD. Well, it's not. The symptoms of ADHD have been around for as long as there have been people. You can read descriptions of what we would now call ADHD from 1,000 years ago. It's just that the lens through which the symptoms was viewed was a different lens. It was the lens of morality. So if you were a kid who had trouble focusing and following instructions and obeying commands, and your diagnosis is that you were bad. It was a moral diagnosis: bad, corrupt, lazy, willful, and the treatment, if you want to call it that, was punishment, often physical punishment. These are the battered children throughout history, and it's a pretty grim and bleak story. These kids, far from being understood, they were punished. They were brutally beaten, sometimes put in chains and manacles and put in asylums. because they quote unquote wouldn't conform, wouldn't behave. And it was a moral diagnosis accompanied with a moral quote unquote treatment in the form of shame, pain, and humiliation. It's a terrible story, a really horrible black mark in the history of humankind, how we dealt with this condition and most other conditions that are under the umbrella of mental health issues. Well, the 20th century came along and a new way of looking things, thank God, came into being. We realized that free will didn't control everything. You see, the moral diagnosis rests upon the assumption that you can control all thinking, emotion, and behavior. That any variation from the norm or from what's asked for and expected is because you're not trying hard enough. And the moral diagnosis therefore says you need to be motivated to do better. And thank goodness in the 20th century we realized, well, there's more to learning emotion and behavior than simply wanting to do whatever is expected of you. Sure, you may want to, but sometimes you just can't. And that's not because of failure of the will. It's not because you've been corrupted by the devil. It's not because you have evil in you that needs to be beaten out of you. No, it's because of brain wiring. It's because of genetics. It's because of how you were born. And you were born with a difference. And that was a huge deal to see it not just through the lens of morality and volition, that there's a brain difference. And in 1937, a landmark year in the history of this condition, Dr. Bradley in Providence, Rhode Island in the United States had a hospital ward full of hyperactive boys, boys who have what we would now call ADHD. And Bradley was a very innovative fellow, and he was trying all kinds of behavioral interventions. He even changed the attire that the people who worked on the ward wore and to minimize stimulation. Well, one day he had read in an unrelated journal about the effect of amphetamine upon behavior. And he decided he wanted to give this speed to these little boys. Well, I often wonder what his head nurse said when he came in and said, okay, let's give these hyperactive boys speed. She must have thought Bradley had gone around the bend at last, but it was a landmark moment when he gave these boys amphetamine, and far from juicing them up and sending them to bounce off the walls, they were able to focus. They were able to wait their turn. They were able to do things cognitively that they had not been able to do, most notably, memorize their math facts. They've been unable to do that, not unwilling, unable. And the kids, far from not liking the medication, loved it. They called it their arithmetic pill, because now they could focus on these infernally boring math facts and learn them. Well, this was a huge deal, a huge, huge deal, because not only did it give a new kind of intervention for this condition, but it showed that the brain is biologically mediated. It's not ruled over by spirits and evil and all this kind of stuff that had been at the core of the moral diagnosis, that the brain was a tissue and susceptible to the same rules of pharmacology and physiology that the rest of the body is governed by. As a huge deal. And it really began the march to where we are today. The condition got renamed minimal brain dysfunction. Now, this was progress, believe it or not, even though I wouldn't want to go to a job interview and say, hi, I'm Ned Hallowell, I have minimal brain dysfunction. Oh, you're our kind of guy, come right in, we'd love to have you. No, but it was progress because it located the problem now in the brain. It was minimal brain dysfunction, not minimal willpower dysfunction or God versus devil or parental dysfunction or teacher dysfunction or societal, but minimal brain dysfunction. And that was the term that was used, through the 50s and into the 60s. And in the 1950s, another molecule was synthesized that got involved in the treatment, namely methylphenidate. And it was synthesized by a man whose wife's name was Rita. And so he named it Ritalin or Ritalin. And that's where that came from in the early 1950s. Well, on we go into the 1970s, when some very pioneering older doctors, Leopold Belloc and Hans Hussey and Paul Wender, noticed that this condition didn't go away during puberty. The old teaching had been somewhere or other, adolescence, the hormones fix it. Well, no, they said, no, it actually persists. And in 1978, they published a monograph called Minimal Brain Dysfunction in Adults. So now we knew that you could have it into adulthood, which of course we now know to be true. And so we began to see adults, and then in the 80s, as the condition got renamed attention deficit disorder, not minimal brain dysfunction any longer, focusing on the supposed deficit of attention. Again, what they really meant was attention wandering, not attention deficit, but they called it attention deficit. And the reason the wandering happens is we who have ADD, we can't do boredom. Boredom is our kryptonite. The minute we experience boredom, we're out of there, wherever might have mentally out of there. We cannot tolerate boredom. So boredom is our kryptonite. So the minute we're bored, our mind goes somewhere else. So it like I say, it's not a deficit, it's a wandering. And on the other hand, the flip side of that is with stimulation, we can pay super attention. So as we were understanding it more, we also realized that girls could have it too. It wasn't just little boys, and it wasn't just men, that females could have it. But the female version tends to be different. Whereas the boys can be hyperactive and disruptive, the girls tend to be not disruptive. They tend to be, if anything, serene. It's the little girl who sits in the back of the room staring out the window, at the sun and the birds and lost in her thoughts. And you have to ask her, what's it like to be in the classroom? And she'll say, oh, it's fine, I'm almost never there. And she doesn't cause any disturbance, so she doesn't get picked up, but she underachieves. And so people assume that she's not that bright, and that's okay. She's not bothering anyone, so let's let her be and, go her slow, mentally slow way, missing the diagnosis that could make such a difference for her. Well, so then we come into the 90s, and we have this condition, we now know it to occur in men and women, boys and girls, and we have a few medications available. And in the 90s, the so-called decade of the brain, the biological underpinnings got really nailed. And Alan Zemetkin's breakthrough study in the New England Journal of Medicine in the early 1990s on differences in glucose metabolism in the brain, basically showing that the areas of the brain that are implicated in ADHD are less active in people who have ADHD than they are in people who don't have the condition. So it showed hypoactivity in areas of the brain that are involved in impulse control, in focusing, and in motor regulation. So now we had PET scan evidence, and the twin adoption studies started to get done, showing that this is a highly heritable condition. There's no one gene, there's a collection of genes, but based on the environment, they're drawn out or not. They're accentuated or not. And also the family studies showing the genetic component. So now we had, and then the MRI evidence showing ever so slight anatomical differences, ever so slight diminution of size and again, those areas of the brain that relate to the functional issues that we see. So we had anatomical evidence, we had metabolic evidence, we had genetic evidence, all of that putting to rest the skeptics who used to say this is a made-up condition, it doesn't really exist. Well, we now know it most surely does exist. Remember, there was a time not too long ago when people said the same thing about depression. You know, if you were depressed, the treatment was to cheer up, get a grip, come on, you know, and there are still people around the world who say, you know, treatment of depression is to cheer up, and the treatment of anxiety is to suck it up, and the treatment for ADHD is to buckle down and try harder. Well, telling someone with ADHD to try harder is no more helpful than telling someone who's nearsighted to squint harder. It misses the biological point. And thank goodness the thrust of the progress has been toward helping people understand that there is a hefty biological contribution here. Effort always helps. Certainly not saying don't stress effort. You know, no matter what you're doing, effort will help. Although my brother-in-law, who's a golf pro, says the key to putting is not caring if the ball goes in the hole. I never quite understand how that helps, but in general, effort helps. Maybe not with putting, but we began to understand the complexity of this, and where my voice began to be heard more and more, I hope, is in looking at the core symptoms of the condition, what Russ Barkley, one of the great researchers in the field, calls the holy trinity of ADHD: distractibility, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, the three negatives. Well, consider for a minute, take those three negative symptoms and turn each one on its head, and you get a positive. What's the flip side of distractibility? It's curiosity. The reason these kids are so distractible is they're so gosh darn curious. They want to know, what's that? What's that? What's that? What's that? They're forever searching. You know, they are forever seeking the answer. Now, that can get them into trouble if they stick their hand into a snake's nest, or if they stick their nose into someone else's business. But it can also lead to the discovery of penicillin. You know, that Petri dish doesn't look the same as when I left it. You know, so curiosity is one of the driving forces of those of us who have this condition. Then the second, impulsivity, you know, that's terrible. Needs to be less impulsive, get a grip, you know. Well, let me ask you, what is creativity but impulsivity gone right? You don't plan to have a creative idea. You don't say it's 10 o'clock, time for my brilliant new idea, and burp it up, you know, no. Creative ideas pop. They come impulsively, unbidden, unplanned, out of nowhere. That's our resource, us with ADHD. It's the land of nowhere, where all of a sudden zooms in this new idea. My friend David Neilman, who founded JetBlue Airlines, he invented the electronic ticket, and he said it came to him out of nowhere, and it's one of the biggest innovations in aviation. He also came up with the idea of putting televisions on the seat in front of you in the airplanes. And, you know, like I told you, people with ADD hate boredom. Well, David hated to be bored on flights. So he said, why don't we put a TV in there? And sure enough, you don't have to be bored now. So these innovations come out of nowhere, unplanned. That's the upside of impulsivity. I'm not saying impulsivity is an unmitigated blessing. No, it can get you into all kinds of trouble, but it can also be the root of discovery and creativity. And then the third in Barkley's triad, hyperactivity. You get to be my age, I'm 71 years old, it's called energy. I'm really glad to have this little turbo pack on my back. I'm really glad to be able to, you know, jump out of bed and take on the world every day and you know, do so with vim and vigor. And these kids tend to have a lot of vim and vigor. So it is a, like I said, it is a condition marked by contradictions, by simultaneous paradoxes. You can be super attentive and your mind can wander, depending upon what's going on in the environment. Now, let's say you're a teacher or a parent and you want to favor attention. Well, three elements combined together create focus. And if you're wanting to bring out the attentive side of someone and minimize the mind wandering side of that person, combine these three elements. Number one is structure. You need to have structure. Excuse me. Number two, novelty. You got to have some novelty. And number three, motivation. If you're motivated, your attention improves. You combine those three. A good example, video games, very structured, full of novelty, and the kid is motivated to play them. ADD goes away. They can play them for hours. And if you're a teacher in the classroom, too much structure, it gets boring. Too much novelty, it gets confusing and overstimulating. So the great teacher is always titrating those two to produce focus. And then when you have focus, you begin to learn and appreciate the success you're having, which is a natural motivator. So you can build into the environment wherever you happen to be, a classroom, playing field, dining room, table, using those, titrating those three, particularly structure and novelty, and then motivation naturally follows as you achieve, the success that you're heading for. I hope I'm driving home the importance of opening up how you look at this to include the positives, because that's what you're trying to develop. When I explain this diagnosis to a kid, let's say he's a 10-year-old boy, and he's sitting on the couch in my office between his two parents. And I'll say to him, I have great news for you. And he'll look at me askance. What do you mean great news? And I'll say, you've got an amazing brain. You've got a Ferrari engine for a brain. You've got a race car for a brain. And he's beginning to nod. Your brain goes a mile a minute. Your brain runs away with you, doesn't it? He said, yeah. Problem is, you've got bicycle brakes. Your brakes aren't strong enough to control the amazing power of your brain. So your brain, runs away with you at times, and you miss things that are going on, and you do things that you wish you hadn't. And, it's like a Ferrari with no brakes, pretty hard to control. So I said, but don't worry, I'm a brake specialist, and we'll learn how to strengthen your brakes so that you will become a champion. And that's how I see these kids, champions in the making. Make sure you give them that strength-based framework so they're much more receptive to getting help. You'd rather see someone to help turn you into a champion than someone to help fix your deficit disorder, which, as I said earlier, is a wrong term anyway. But rather strengthen the brakes of a race car brain. That's a lot more motivating and inspiring than fixing a deficit disorder. Really important how you frame it. And indeed, the starting point of treatment, if you want to call it treatment, is education, is framing it properly, framing it in a strength-based fashion. So you're saying we're in the business of producing champions here. We're not treating people who have deficit disorder. And how you frame it for the kid is important. And by the way, that's accurate. It's not blowing smoke. That's an accurate representation. What Ross Barkley basically conceptualizes ADD as a syndrome of trouble with self-regulation, of disinhibition, and that's a fancy way of saying poor brakes. You can't inhibit what's coming in, hence you're distractible. You can't inhibit what's going out, hence you're impulsive and perhaps hyperactive or very restless. So framing it properly, not only for your child but for you, and if you're an adult who has it, for you as well. You want to be able to take advantage of the upside. So what else goes into making a diagnosis? Well, the most telltale sign is unexplained underachievement. whether you're a first grader or a college senior or early in your career, whatever age you are, unexplained underachievement. My oldest patient was 86 years old. He's a man who had been wanting to write a book his entire life. And once we got treatment for him, he was able to write the book. Pretty impressive. You know, I'm sorry about these cats, but I hope they're not bothering you too much. They're lovable little creatures. Unexplained underachievement is the first tip off, the one that brings more people to me than any other. And then problems with executive functioning, so-called executive functioning, planning, organizing, prioritizing. In general, we have trouble with that. And it's, you know, it's again, the problems with the prefrontal cortex. We can see it on MRI. By the way, brain scans are not diagnostic tests, but they have been useful in research in elucidating differences between ADHD populations and non-ADHD populations. We have a unique sense or lack of sense around time. In our world, in the world of ADHD, there are basically only two times. There's now and there's not now. So you know, you say the exam is next Thursday or the paper is due in 2 weeks. Not now, and it's gone, out of mind, until not now is almost now. And then at the last minute, you get it done in a panic. At the very last minute, you get the thing done. Because what happens in a panic? Your body puts out a lot of adrenaline. Well, adrenaline is chemically very similar to stimulant medication. So basically, without knowing it, you're self-medicating with panic, with adrenaline. And that's why we as a group tend to procrastinate so much. We tend to live from crisis to crisis, from procrastination to procrastination. And we get things done usually, but we pay a big price in terms of stress and Sturm und Drang. Time difference. We also can be very impatient. Hurry it up, move it along, cut to the chase. That can be adaptive in a business meeting if you get everything done quickly, but not so much in a romantic conversation. Okay, so you love me. What's your next point? We have trouble lingering over the moment, whether it's an I love you moment or a sunset or pictures at an exhibition. We have trouble with that. We have an extraordinary intuition. We can see into people, into projects. We can see around corners. We are inordinately honest to the point of being tactless, to the point of offending people. We just have the hardest time dissembling. We are not good apple polishers at all. We're not good at kissing up at all. We tend to say what we feel. We're really transparent, and we tend to hate hypocrisy. We despise hypocrisy wherever we see it. We can't stand it. We have a real vulnerability to addiction. We're about 6 to 8 times more common addiction in the ADHD population than in the general population, and 80% of addiction starts between the ages of 13 and 23. So that's the age group that is most at risk. And so you want to really pay attention. It's not only chemical addiction, but behavioral addictions, sex, gambling, shopping, screens, all of the behavioral addictions come into play, as well as, the substance use. It's a disease, and unfortunately, it is a disease that is often laid in the moral model. You're a bad person, and that stigma prevents a lot of people from getting help, and it just does a terrible job on their willingness to get help and their willingness to acknowledge the condition that they've got. Anyone who has an addiction, look for undiagnosed ADHD. Because when you treat the ADHD, let's say with medication, it's so much easier to give up your addiction. And the point is, once you find the right medication, you can stop using the wrong medication, whether it was alcohol or cocaine or whatever it might have happened to be, or a behavioral addiction. Once you find the right medication, you're able to give up what you were self-medicating with in a self-destructive fashion. Really important clinical point to always think of the possibility of undiagnosed ADHD in anyone who has substance abuse issues. A couple of more things to look for. Tendency to externalize. People with ADD, we tend to put the locus of control outside of ourselves. It wasn't me who did it, you know, and so a tendency to externalize. And also, cousin to that, we're very poor self-observers. We're not really aware of how we come across, and that's why it's good to learn that, so you can rely on feedback from trusted others. We really need that. Due to the underachievement and due to the lectures about trying harder, our self-esteem also tends to suffer. And most people with ADD perceive themselves in a much more negative light than most people perceive them to be. And along with that becomes something that has been called rejection sensitive dysphoria, where it just means that we are extraordinarily sensitive to rejection and criticism. Nobody likes rejection and criticism, but we can just go to the basement, the mere hint or whiff of a criticism, and we just think the world is caving in, and we become immobilized and gloomy and brooding and just inconsolable over what to another person would seem like a pretty trivial criticism or rejection sensitive dysphoria. Well, those are the highlights of what goes into this condition at all ages. But and the point is, if you can name it early on and start intervening, your chances of tapping into, as I say, unwrapping the gift rather than treating the disability, your chances of unwrapping the gift go way up if you can get in there soon, because, you know, all that damage to self-esteem that the years can do. And that's the real disability, believing you're a loser. That's the disability. That's what hurts somebody. It's not the ADHD we can deal with, the dyslexia we can deal with, but it's the believing that you're a loser, believing that you're defective, believing you have a deficit. That's what's impairing. So the sooner you can get in there, the better. So what do you do once you get in there? Well, it starts with education, just what we've been doing, helping someone understand it's not a moral problem. It's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of discipline. It's you have a brain that's wired differently, and so wonderfully differently, but it can also be perniciously difficultly and cause all kinds of problems. So you want to learn that, and learn that it's a spectrum of traits with positives and negatives, and then you want to try to maximize the positives. Now, the intervention that everyone has heard about, and it's the next to last chapter in my book ADHD 2.0, is medication. And in the book I call it the most powerful tool everyone fears. And unfortunately, medication is vastly misunderstood. People are basically afraid of it. You know, and people ask me, do you believe in Ritalin? And my answer is, it's not a religious principle. You know, it's a medication, and it should be dealt with as such. If it helps you and doesn't cause side effects, then take it. If it doesn't help you or does cause side effects, then don't take it. And people make it into so much more of a deal than that. And it's a shame, and they imagine all kinds of consequences of taking it that just aren't true. If you take it and you don't have side effects, you're safe. And you know, and as I said, you're staving off the really bad side effect, i.e. the side effects of not taking it, which are years of frustration and underachievement. You know, so these meds, when used properly, are a godsend. And unfortunately, they're feared instead of respected and understood. The main side effect of stimulant medication is appetite suppression. As long as you maintain your caloric intake, that's fine, as long as you don't lose weight. So you have to monitor your weight. Theoretically, if you start losing weight, you should stop the medication. That rarely happens. My patients, learn how to eat enough to not lose weight. There can be other side effects, which are reversible right away by lowering the dose or stopping the medication. Those include elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, insomnia if you take it too close to bedtime. Some people just don't like the way it makes them feel. They can feel weird, or personality change, loss of sense of humor. Anything like that happens, you just stop the meds and the side effect goes away. If you turn purple, stop the meds, you'll go back to your original color. Never seen that happen, but who knows? The point being that if you have a doctor who knows what he or she is doing, these meds are manageable, and that's good news, because the benefits they confer are tremendous. They strengthen your brakes. Another analogy I use, untreated ADD is like driving on square wheels. Well, the meds can round out the wheels. You get a lot more mileage on round wheels with less effort than on square wheels. And people say, well, shouldn't we do a year or two of non-medication treatment before we try medication? And you see, that sort of belies an underlying fear of medication. To me, saying, and I say to people, sure, I've written books about how to do that, but it's sort of like saying, why don't we do a year or two of squinting before we try eyeglasses? Why not go straight to the proven intervention that makes all the other interventions so much easier to implement? It's so much easier to coach someone, for example, or tutor someone if they're on medication and it works than if they're not. It's easier to engage, easier to get their attention, easier to drill down and study. So why not try that proven intervention first and then build upon it instead of waiting, as if medication were a drastic intervention. It's not a drastic intervention. Can it be dangerous? Sure. If you overdose or snort it, buy it and sell it, yes, it's a drug of abuse. It has a street value. So sure, this can be a dangerous substance. So I'm not saying it can't be. I'm just saying, if you treat it with respect and have a doctor who knows how to follow you and supervise you, then you're safe. And it's just a shame that the general public is so misinformed, and including some medical personnel who don't realize it as well. So what else goes into unwrapping the gift? And I've mentioned medication as sort of, that could be your starting point, but after education is always the starting point. But what else goes into it? Well, coaching, someone to help you get organized. Now, this is what a parent does, but there comes an age where what a parent does is felt as nagging. So a coach is sort of what a parent would do minus the nag factor. So you want to as the kid gets older, maybe you hire someone. It's sort of a combination of a tutor and an organizational assistant, to help them learn new habits of so-called executive function, because that's where a lot of the problems reside. So a coach to help you with that, and then a process, what I call creating stellar environments. You want to create stellar environments, and by that I mean environments that are low on fear and high on trust. Low on fear and high on trust. I'll tell you how I had a teacher who did it for me. Back in 1955, I was in the first grade in a little town in Chatham, Massachusetts, where I grew up. And I started first grade, and I was supposed to learn to read. That's what we did in first grade. And I couldn't get it. The other kids were learning to sound out the words, not little Ned. And I just didn't get phonics. It didn't come to me. And back then in the 50s in Chatham, if you couldn't learn to read, your diagnosis was pretty obvious. It was called stupid. And your treatment plan was try harder. Then if that didn't work, well, you're very stupid. Well, I was so lucky. One of the many reasons I believe in God, I had a teacher named Mrs. Eldridge. And she had no formal training in reading that I know of, but she'd been teaching first grade for about 75 years. And she just knew there was more to little boys and girls who couldn't learn to read than being stupid. And there were better ways to help them than telling them to try harder. Well, what would Mrs. Eldridge do? During reading period, we'd be sitting at these little round tables, taking turns reading out loud. And it'd come to be my turn and I couldn't do it. I would stammer, I would stutter. Well, she would just come over and sit down next to me. And it was back when old ladies wore a lot of powder. And so she'd arrive like a sugar donut, you know, sprinkling all around me, these clumps of powder. And she'd put her arm around me. So I'd have her arm here and my little head here and this enormous cushion here that she would hug me into. And none of the other kids would laugh at me as I struggled because I had the mafia sitting next to me. And that was my treatment plan. It was Mrs. Eldridge's arm. Not only did I not fear reading period, I looked forward to it because I looked forward to that hug I would get. She didn't excuse me from reading. She said, keep trying, you'll get there sooner or later. And I wanted to, because the part of me that had a natural curiosity about words got activated. It would have been snuffed out had I felt ashamed and embarrassed. But because I didn't acquire the disabilities of shame and fear, the part of me that actually wanted to learn was able to get activated. And by the end of the year, I was still the worst reader in the class, but I was the most enthusiastic student of reading. And that lady's arm has stayed around me ever since. I'm still, to this day, an incredibly slow reader. It just is, it's very hard for me to get through a book. My wife says, I can't believe you know anything. You're such a slow reader. But I majored in English at Harvard and graduated with high honors while doing pre-med. So I had to be able to read somewhat to do that. And now I make my living with words. So again, that's the paradoxical nature of this condition. It combines benefits with liabilities. And again, you want to always be working to promote the upside, promote the benefits. In addition to creating stellar environments, you want to promote physical exercise. My colleague, John Rady, wrote a wonderful book called Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain. And you want to keep kids moving, adults moving, move your body, move your body. We just don't do well stagnating. We don't do well without activity. We need movement, daily exercise. Never hold kids in for recess as a punishment. Have them, you know, pick up the grounds or something, but if you want to have a consequence, but keep them moving, keep them in action. And also make sure they get plenty of human connection. Today is sort of a digital world. It can be very impersonal. Make sure they get plenty of human connection. I call it the other vitamin C, vitamin connect. We thrive on connection and we do very poorly if we don't have it. Well, these are the basic elements of what goes into drawing out the best. I'll end with one final one because I think it's so tremendously important. Find a creative outlet. The reason I write so many books, I'm not ambitious to write books. If I don't have a book going, I get depressed. And the same is true with these kids. They need a creative outlet. We need to exercise that part of our brain, the creative part of our brain. More than the average person does. We need that creative outlet. In the book, I call it your right difficult, because it needs to be difficult. It needs to be challenging or we'll get bored. But it's got to be in your realm of affinities as well. So find your right difficult. And that, you know, my right difficult is writing. And I've been doing it ever since I was a kid. So find that and it will sustain you over a lifetime. I hope all of this has made sense to you. I wish I were with you so I could take your questions. If you want to learn more, go to my website, dr.hallowell.com, Hallowell.com. It was built by a dear friend who just did a miraculous job of creating this website. She's a remarkable, remarkable woman, and I'm deeply in her debt. I'm also in your debt for giving me your attention for this period of time, and I hope my message made sense to you. I'd love to hear from you. If you want to send me an email, send it to dr.hallowell, drhallowell@gmail.com. Bless you, and I hope you'll re-envision how you look at this condition as a gift that's hard to unwrap. instead of a deficit disorder, as a condition that is endlessly interesting, complicated, and variegated, and really a marvelous part of the human difference condition. Thank you so much for your attention, and goodbye for now.